What would you do if $1 bought you nothing but your own grave? In the autumn of 1849, 23-year-old Adela Ferrers, orphaned the same month she was evicted, paid Magistrate Silas Roper a single dollar for the condemned Rookhaven Castle on the hill above the town of Wychbourne, in Shropshire. He handed her the ruin to be rid of her for good, and thought the cold would finish what his ledger had begun. What Silas Roper did not know, as he turned back to his warm fire, was the name that Castle's dead clock tower had kept for 40 years, cut into a plate no living man had troubled to read. But the truth waiting behind its silent bell was not a curse, and it was not a debt. It was a name. Settle in, and let us travel back to the market town of Wychbourne. In the cold autumn of 1849, the debt court sat in the old wool exchange, and on that grey morning it was full. Adela stood before the bench in her one good dress, and did not weep. Her father had been 3 weeks in the ground. The magistrate read the account aloud, so that every clerk and creditor in the room might hear it. Ferrers, watch and clock repair, Silas Roper said. Debts to the sum of £81, and no estate to answer them but a dead man's tools. He set the tools on the bench, a roll of steel files and one small brass key, as if they weighed nothing at all. The court seizes the shop. The daughter quits the premises by Saturday. The shop is my whole living, sir, Adela said. Leave me the tools and 1 year, and I will pay you every shilling of it. A woman cannot hold a repair license in this borough, Roper answered. You know that as well as I do. Then license my work to a freeman, and let me do it under his name, she said. It has been done before now. A few of the clerks smiled at that. The magistrate did not. It will not be done by me, he said. He let the quiet settle over the room, and then he did the thing he had come prepared to do. He drew a folded deed from inside his coat and laid it beside her father's tools. The court is not without mercy, he said, and he pitched it for the gallery. There is a property on the books that no man alive will buy. Rookhaven, on the hill, the old castle, condemned these 40 years. I will make you a gift of it, Miss Ferrers, for the sum of $1, and I will count your father's debt eased by the charity of it. The gallery understood the joke before she did. Rookhaven had no sound roof left to it. Its gate tower leaned over the coach road like a drunk man, and its clock had not struck since their grandfathers were boys. To give the place away was to give away a burden of repair that no purse in the county could ever meet. You are all laughing, Adela said to the room, because you believe he has been kind. I have been kind, said Roper. You have been rid of me, she said, and you have called it alms. That struck him, because it was true, and because the clerks had heard her say it. His jaw went hard. Take the dollar deed, or take the road, he said. It is all one to this court. She looked down at the brass key on the bench, the little tuning key her father had carried every working day of his life. On its bow was stamped a mark she had never once troubled to read, 2 joined letters worn almost smooth. She took the key up first, and closed her hand around it. Then she took the deed. I will take the castle, she said. Then you are dismissed, said Silas Roper, and he had already turned to the next case, certain he would never think of her again. 2 questions must trouble you here, as they troubled Wychbourne for 40 years. Who once built a clock grand enough to crown a castle, and then let it fall silent? And whose name was it the tower kept, when every other name in the town was cut in stone and remembered? Before Adela lifts that latch, if you have ever watched a woman's work be quietly signed away under another person's name, subscribe to Lantern&Ledger and stay for the striking of it. Now, as the last light slid off the fells, Adela Ferrers set her shoulder to the castle door. It gave with a groan and let her into a cold that was older than the cold outside. The great hall of Rookhaven stood open to the sky in one corner, where a roof beam had come down long ago. Ivy had grown in through a window and died there. Frost furred the flagstones. She stood in the ruin she now owned and understood fully what the magistrate had given her. Not a home, a slow way to die out of his sight. She stood there long enough for the cold to reach her feet. A lesser grief might have turned her straight back down the hill to beg the magistrate for a corner in the poorhouse. But Adela had spent her whole life in a room where broken things were brought to be mended, and she had never once learned to see a ruin and think only of the ruin. Some part of her, the part her father had made, was already counting the sound chimneys and the dry corners, already asking what in the place might yet be saved. It was not hope, quite. It was habit, and habit would serve until hope could be afforded. Then she heard the sound. A small, dry scrape from the far end of the hall, near the cold hearth. Something living was in the castle with her. "Who is there?" she called. Her voice went up into the broken roof and came back thin. "I mean you no harm. This is my house now, for what it is worth, and I would rather share it than be afraid in it." No answer came. She crossed the hall with her father's key still shut in her fist, and found him crouched in the hearth cavity. A boy of perhaps 11, thin as a lath, his knees drawn up under a coat that was all holes. He watched her mouth with a fierce, frightened attention and did not speak. On the stone beside him lay a scrap of slate and a nub of chalk. "You need not be afraid of me," Adela said slowly, and she saw at once that he was reading her lips, not her voice. She knelt so the last light fell on her face. "What is your name?" The boy took up the chalk and wrote, and turned the slate to her. "Jonah," she read aloud. "Jonah, good, I am Adela." She pointed to herself and said it again, and touched her ear and shook her head to show him she understood the words never reached him. He watched, and then he wrote again, fast, and showed her. "They put me out," she read. "The clockmaker said a deaf boy cannot mind a striking train, no use to the trade." She looked up from the slate. "The guild turned you out?" He nodded once, hard. She had one heel of bread in her satchel and a rind of cheese. And it was all the food she owned in the world. She had been saving it against the morning, when she would have to walk down and beg work of the very men who had laughed at her. She looked at the bread, and then at the boy, and there was not much to argue. She broke the bread and gave him the larger half, and all of the cheese. "Eat," she said, and mimed it. "There is a dry corner under the stair, out of the wind. You will take that. I will take the hearth." Jonah stared at the food as though it might be a trick. Then he ate it in quick, guarding bites, watching her over his knuckles. When he had finished, he wrote on the slate again and held it up, and this time his hand was not so steady. "Why?" it said. "Only that." "Because no one did it for me," Adela said. "And I have not forgotten how the cold felt." She did not know if he caught all of it, but he read her face, and something in his own loosened by a degree, and he crept to the dry corner she had shown him and slept. Adela did not sleep. She sat by the dead hearth with the brass key in her palm and turned it over, and for the first time in her grief she considered the worn mark stamped on its bow. 2 letters, joined at the stem. In the failing light she could not read them. She only knew her father had guarded that key above every other tool, and had never once told her why. The days that followed were labor and little else. Adela had grown up on the floor of a repair shop. She knew the patience of it, the slow order of cleaning a thing before you dared to mend it, and she set that patience against the ruin. She swept the driest end of the hall. She learned which chimneys would draw, and which would only smoke. Jonah did not leave. He fetched and carried without being asked, and she found that he could feel through his feet and his hands what she could not always hear: the shudder of a loose stone, the tremor of a beam about to give. She taught him at night by the fire, drawing the parts of a clock in the ash with a stick, because it was the one language she owned and wished to give him. She drew the going train that turned the hands, and the striking train that rang the hour, and between them the count wheel, the notched disc that told the bell how many times to sound. "The count wheel keeps the tally," she said, tracing the notches. "Without it a clock strikes forever, or not at all. It is the memory of the thing." Jonah pressed his fingers to the drawing as though he might feel the notches, and wrote on his slate, "Who taught you?" And she answered, "My father," and did not trust her voice past that. There was more to teach than notches, and the long evenings gave her time for it. She showed him the escapement, the small steel anchor that lets the pendulum feed the wheels their permission to turn, one measured beat at a time. She showed him how a movement dies, not all at once, she said, but tooth by tooth, as old oil turns to a glue that seizes the pivots, until a clock that might have run 300 years stands still for want of a cleaning. "A clock does not break like a cup," she told him, and drew a seized pivot in the ash. "It is strangled slowly, and mostly it is strangled by neglect. Almost any dead clock can be woken, Jonah, if a patient hand takes it far enough down and is not afraid of the labor." He read her lips and wrote back, "Even a big one. A tower one. Even a tower one," she said, and did not yet know she had promised him anything. The bigger the clock, the slower it dies, and the more of it is left to save. Jonah kept that slate. She saw him take it to his corner and read it again by the last of the fire, as another child might keep a picture. And she understood that no one had troubled to teach the boy a single thing in his life, but that he was of no use. She did not go near the tower. The gate tower leaned over the road, and its bell hung dead in a frame she did not trust, and she had troubles enough at ground level. But the tower would not let her leave it alone for long. On the 9th night the weather came off the fells in earnest. The storm rose after dark, a hard west wind that drove the rain flat against the stone and set the whole ruin creaking. Adela banked the fire, and thought the tower nothing to do with her, until the sound began. High above, a slow, uneven tolling, as the wind caught the dead bell and swung it against its own frame. It was no clean ring, it was a sick, staggering clang, the sound of a great weight working itself loose. Jonah came awake at once, though he could not have heard it. He came awake because he felt it, the shudder of the strike traveling down through 40 feet of stone into the floor where he lay. And he sat up with his hands flat on the flags and his eyes enormous. The bell never reached his ears. He could feel it coming through the castle like a heartbeat gone wrong, and it terrified him past reason. "It is only the wind in the old bell," Adela said, kneeling to him. But he could not read her face in the dark, and his whole small body was rigid with the dread of a sound he could feel and never play. There was nothing for it. She lit a lantern, and she went up to still the bell. The tower stair wound up through the dark, wet where the rain drove in, treacherous with fallen mortar. She climbed with one hand on the cold newel and the storm shouting on the far side of the wall. At the top she came into the bell chamber, and the wind nearly took the lantern from her. The great bell swung in a frame whose stay had rotted through, a beam of iron working loose from its seat with every gust, and each time the wind pushed it the bell struck its own frame and sent that sick shudder down into the stone. She set the lantern in a niche and got her shoulder under the loosened stay, and by main strength and a wedge of fallen wood she pinned the beam still. The bell hung silent, the awful tolling stopped, and far below, she hoped, the tremor stopped for Jonah too. It was only then, catching her breath, that she saw the door. Behind the bell frame, where no door had any business being, The wall of the chamber was not a wall. A panel of oak stood flush in the stone, black with age, banded with iron. The storm's shaking had sprung it a finger's width from its jamb, and behind it was not more stone but a small, close room, and a cold that smelled of oil and iron and old paper. Adela took up the lantern and pushed the panel wide. She stood in a room that no one had entered in 40 years. It was the movement room of the tower clock, sealed behind the bell, and everything in it had waited. The great frame of the clock stood in the center. Brass gone green, iron gone brown. The going train and the striking train locked with the grease of decades turned to stone. Weights hung on their cables in the shaft below. Dust lay on all of it, even and undisturbed, the dust of a thing shut up on purpose. And on the back plate of the movement, where every maker of that age cut his name, someone had cut 2 letters, run together at the foot. She brought the lantern close, and her breath stopped. The mark on the back plate was the mark on her father's tuning key. The same 2 joined letters. The same hand. It was cut clean and deep and unashamed, a maker's own plain signature, untouched by any later tool. "That is not possible," she said aloud, to the dead clock in the dark. And it was not the name the whole county revered. Here was a clock grand enough to crown a castle, signed with confidence by a hand that was not the celebrated founder's, and then bricked away where no living soul would ever read it. Someone had not scraped this mark out. Someone had done the easier thing and simply shut it in the dark. The question was whose hand it was, and why a maker's own name should have to be hidden behind a bell. She did not sleep again that night. She sat in the sealed room with the dead clock and her father's key, laying the one mark against the other until the lantern guttered, and a single, wrong idea took hold of her, because it was the only idea the town had ever given her to hold. Everyone in Witchbourne knew who had built the great clocks of the county. The Guildhall clock, the pride of the town, the one the whole shire set its watches by, had been made by Nathaniel Roper, warden of the Clockmakers' Guild and grandfather to the magistrate himself. His name was cut on a brass tablet in the Guildhall for anyone to read. If a clock this grand crowned Rookhaven, Adela reasoned, then it too must be early Roper work, unsigned or signed in some guild cipher, and the sealed room a store of guild silver hidden in a bad year and forgotten. It was a poor theory, but it fit the only names she had been given, and it sent her down the hill at first light with her father's key in her pocket to prove it. She meant to compare the 2 clocks. She meant to lay the castle's mark against Nathaniel Roper's own and settle it. She had no notion that in going to look she would knock the first stone out of a wall the Ropers had spent 2 generations keeping up. The Guildhall of Witchbourne opened its doors at 7 for the clerks, and Adela was on the step when the beadle drew the bolt. He was an old man with a soft heart and a bad chest, and he knew her father's name. "Farrer's girl," he said. "You should not be seen begging here." "I am not begging," Adela said. "I have come to look at the clock. My father cleaned it once, years back. I would see his work before the guild takes his tools for good. 10 minutes, and I am gone." He should have refused her. Instead, he coughed and looked up the empty street and stood aside. 10 minutes, he said, and you were never here. The Guildhall clock stood in a tall oak case at the foot of the stairs, its pendulum swinging slow and certain. The proud heart of the town. Adela opened the trunk door and knelt and brought her father's lantern stub close to the back plate, where the maker cut his name. And there it was, deep and clear, the pride of the shire, Nathaniel Roper, warden, and a date near 60 years gone. She almost stood up satisfied. The name was there, exactly as the town said. Her whole theory was proved, and it was a small, sad thing, and she nearly closed the door on it. But her father had drilled into her never to trust the first surface of anything. So she did what he would have done. She wetted her thumb and rubbed the plate below the engraved name, and she held the light at a slant as you catch a worn hallmark, and the brass gave up its secret to the low light. Under Nathaniel Roper's proud, deep name there were older strokes. A shallower cutting, half scraped away and struck over, that the deeper name had been laid on top of to hide. 2 letters, run together. The same mark that stood on the Rookhaven plate. The same mark stamped on the little brass key in her pocket. Nathaniel Roper had not made the Guildhall clock. He had signed his name over someone else's. That cannot be, she whispered, and yet the brass did not care what she believed. Her theory was not soft. It was wrong, entirely wrong, in the one way she had not thought to test, and the truth of it sat cold in her stomach. The greatest clocks in the county carried a name that had been cut out and cut over. Someone had been erased from the metal itself. You have had your 10 minutes. The voice came from the stair above her. Adela stood and turned. A tall man in a good gray coat came down toward her, and she knew him for the guildmaster by the seal on his watch chain. This was Osric Thorne, who held the wardenship the Ropers had built. Master Thorne, she said, you are the farrier's woman the magistrate housed on the hill. Thorne said. He looked at the open clock case, and something moved behind his eyes and was put away. What are you doing at the founder's clock with a light? Reading it, Adela said. A mark hides under the warden's name. An older mark. I think you have seen it. There is a guild cipher on every founder piece. Thorne said, smooth as oil. It means nothing to a layman, and less to a woman with a debt. Close the case. It is the same mark that is on the clock at Rookhaven, she said. The castle you all forgot. It strikes on both. Whose is it? For a breath he did not answer, and in that breath she saw that he knew exactly whose it was, and had known all his life. There is no clock at Rookhaven, Thorne said at last. There is a heap of stone the town condemned before you were born. Go back to it, Miss Ferrers, and be grateful. And do not come here again reading marks you cannot understand. A debt like your father's can be forgiven or it can be enforced. Guild men decide which. Remember that. He held the door for her himself, which was its own kind of threat, and Adela walked back up the hill, knowing 3 things she had not known at dawn. The founder's clock was not the founder's. The guildmaster knew it. And her father's key was cut with the mark of whoever the guild had spent 2 generations burying. She went back into the sealed room above the bell and searched it properly, by daylight, as her father searched a movement, slow and complete. Behind the great clock frame, set into the wall on an iron shelf, she found a strongbox, and its lock gave to the small brass key as if the key had been made for it. It had been. Inside was not silver. Inside was paper. It was a master's ledger, bound in cracked calf, its pages close, written in a fine, sloping hand, and every entry dated. Drawings of movements, calculations of trains and counts, the tally of every great clock the maker had built for 40 years of a working life. Town by town, church by church, house by house. The Guildhall clock was in it, dated and drawn, 6 years before Nathaniel Roper ever registered a piece in his own name. And on the first page, plain and unashamed, was the entire name that the brass had been made to forget. Cecily Vane. Her work, her hand, her mark, the 2 joined letters, C and V, that a warden had cut his own name over and called his founding glory. Adela sat on the cold floor of the movement room and read the dead woman's life by the light from the bell chamber, and she understood at last what her father had carried in his pocket every day and never once explained. She read until she found the final entries, and there the fine hand grew unsteady. And then, It stopped, and after the last of it someone else had written 3 lines in a rougher script. And those 3 lines were the reason for everything. She read the 3 rough lines twice before she let herself believe them. They were not in the maker's fine hand. They were a clerk's or a keeper's, dated the spring the fine hand stopped. Workrooms sealed by order of the warden, she read aloud to the empty tower. Tools and papers held in guild-keeping. The woman Vane removed to the county asylum, being of unsound mind and given to false claims upon the work of her betters. She lowered the ledger. False claims upon her own work, she said. They sealed the proof in the same room they sealed her out of, and wrote her mad across the front of it. The cold of that sat in her worse than the cold of the stone. A man had not merely stolen a life of work. He had shut the evidence of the theft in a tower and bricked a bell across it, and trusted 40 years and a condemned deed to keep it dark. He had very nearly been right. Only $1 of charity, meant as a cruelty, had put the one key that opened it into the one hand that would read it. She needed to know who Cecily Vane had been to the living, not only to the brass. And in Witchbourne there was one person old enough to remember. The beadle had let a name slip once, of a woman who had scrubbed for the castle in her girlhood. Adela found her in an almshouse room at the edge of town, a tiny, upright woman past 80 with a clear and wary eye. Her name was Constance Weir. "I know why you have come," Constance said before Adela had well sat down. "You have the look of it. You have found her." "I have found a ledger," Adela said. "Cecily Vane. The Rookhaven clock is hers. The Guildhall clock is hers. Every great clock in the Shire is hers, and Nathaniel Roper cut his name over the top. Was it true?" "You were there." The old woman's hands worked in her lap. For a long moment Adela thought she would not speak at all. "I was 14, Constance said finally. "I carried her coal and her candles in the tower shop at Rookhaven. She was the finest maker in 3 counties, and everyone knew it, and no one would say it out loud, because the guild would not take a woman's name upon its roll. So her work went out under her husband's hand while he lived. He signed what she built. That was the bargain a clever woman made in those years. She built, and a man's name went on the brass, and the town admired the man." "And when her husband died?" Adela asked. "Then the trouble came," said Constance. "A widow could not hold the shop. Nathaniel Roper was warden. He came to her with papers, all very kind, and he took the shop into the guild's keeping, to protect it, he said. And her drawings with it, and her marks. And within 2 years every clock she had ever made carried his name, cut fresh over her own, and the town said what a genius the warden was, to have built so much so young. She would have fought it, Adela said. A ledger exists. She kept proof. She did fight it, Constance said, and now the old voice shook. She stood up in the very Guildhall and named him a thief before the alderman. "And do you know what a man does with a woman who will not be quiet, child, when he holds the law and the guild and the purse, and she holds nothing but the truth?" Constance leaned forward. "He calls her mad." 2 physicians and a magistrate signed the order. They said grief had turned her wits, that she raved and claimed men's work for her own. They shut her in the county asylum, and they sealed her workroom in the tower, so no one would go looking. And in 11 years she died there, and the town forgot she had ever held a file. That is what he did. I have carried it 40 years. The room was very quiet. "There is a boy at my castle the guild put out this month," Adela said. "For being deaf. No use to the trade, they told him. Nothing changes with these men. They decide who is of use, and they bury the rest, and they sign their names on what is left. Then you know what you are holding," Constance said, "and you know what they will do to keep it buried. Roper's grandson is magistrate now. Thorne holds the guild. The clock on the Guildhall wall is the whole worth of the Roper name. If you can prove it was hers, you unmake 3 generations of them in a single afternoon. They will not let you live quiet on your hill while you can do that. No, Adela said. I do not expect they will. She was right. It began the next morning. Osric Thorne came up to Rookhaven himself, with 2 guild men behind him and a leather purse in his hand. And he did not trouble to be kind. He found Adela in the yard and set the purse on the mounting block between them. £81, Thorne said. Your father's debt, paid in full, discharged and witnessed. And a pension besides, £1 a month for your life, which is more than you will ever earn on this ruin. That is the guild's offer, Miss Ferrers, and it is generous. For what? Adela said, though she knew. For the ledger, the strongbox, and the 2 plates, he said. For the clock never striking. For a closed mouth. You give me what you found in the tower, you sign a paper saying there was nothing in it, and you never speak the name Vane again. Take the purse. It is a great deal of money for a heap of old brass no one has missed in 40 years. Adela looked at the purse. £81 was her father's honor squared away, and a roof over her head, and never being cold or hungry again. It was everything the last month had taken from her, offered back in 1 leather bag. And the price of it was Cecily Vane's name, sold a second time, by another hand, over the same grave. My father kept her key for 40 years unsold, Adela said. He was her last apprentice. Did you know that? A boy she taught, when the guild would have had him sweeping. He carried her mark in his pocket to the day he died, and never told me whose it was, because to say it aloud was dangerous, even then, even to me. He kept faith with a silenced woman his whole life, and it cost him. And you think I will sell her for the price of his debt? She pushed the purse back across the stone. Take your money down the hill, Master Thorne. Thorne's smooth manner went out like a snuffed candle. You foolish girl, he said. You think this is a story with a just ending. It is not. There is nothing at Rookhaven but fallen stone. There will be no clock on that hill. The magistrate has already signed the order. What order? The gate tower is unsafe, Thorne said, and he smiled now, because this was the part he had come to enjoy, a danger to the public road. It is to be pulled down for the safety of the town, before the Michaelmas fair fills that road with folk. The tackle comes at dawn on fair day. Whatever you imagine you found up there will be under 40 tons of rubble by noon, and the county will go on setting its watches by Nathaniel Roper, as it has always done. You could have had the pension. Now you will have the duck. He turned at the gate. Enjoy your last 3 days of it. They went down the hill, and Adela stood in the yard a long time, and then she went and found Jonah, who had watched all of it from the stair with his hands flat on the stone, feeling the anger in the men's boots. They are going to pull the tower down, she said, slowly, so he could read every word. On fair day, at noon, to bury the clock and the name with it. Jonah wrote fast on his slate and turned it to her. Then we make it strike first. Adela looked at the boy, and at the leaning tower, and at the 3 days she had, and something in her that the magistrate had tried very hard to kill, stood up straight. Yes, she said. We make it strike first, before the whole town, louder than any order he can sign. What followed were 3 days and 2 nights of work, such as neither of them had done in their lives. The movement had stood dead for 40 years, and every arbor was seized, every pivot glued in hardened grease, the count wheel frozen mid-tally. Adela stripped the great clock down to its frame as her father had shown her, part by part, each laid on cloth in the order it came off. She cleaned each pivot with spirit and a sharpened stick. She freed the escapement, the anchor that let the pendulum feed the train its slow permission to move. She oiled where oil belonged and nowhere else, because a clock drowned in oil is as dead as a clock choked with dust. The hardest part was the count wheel, the notched brass disc that governs how many times the bell may sound. Its notches had corroded shallow, and a shallow notch lets the strike run on, 12 where it should be 1, or locks the bell dead. Adela dressed each notch true with a fine file, counting under her breath, while Jonah held a candle and watched her mouth. 1 notch for 1, she said, 2 for 2, on to 12. And then it starts again. If I cut a single notch wrong, the clock will lie about the hour for the next 100 years, and every soul in the Shire will trust the lie. She blew the brass dust away. So we do not cut 1 wrong. Jonah wrote, "It is her count still. We only clean it." "Yes," Adela said, and stopped, because the boy had put in 5 chalk words the whole of what she meant to do. "We only clean it. The tally is hers. We are just the hands that let it be heard." Jonah was worth 10 grown apprentices. He could not hear the click of a good pallet, but he could feel it. He laid his fingertips on the frame while she tested the escapement, and told her by his face, when the beat came even, tick and tock the same weight, because his whole body was an ear. He felt the count wheel drop into each notch. He felt the strike train worn and locked. Between them, the deaf boy and the woman no borough would license. They woke a clock that a warden had murdered a woman to keep asleep. On the eve of the fair, in the last light, Adela set the count wheel true, and hung the weights and drew the going train into motion with 1 finger, and the pendulum took up its long, certain swing, and the Rookhaven clock ticked in the tower for the first time since Cecily Vane was carried away raving that she had built it. Adela did not wind the striking train. Not yet. The strike would keep for noon and for the town. She took the ledger and the strongbox down that night and gave them to Constance Weir and the beadle to keep, out of the castle, where Thorne's men would not find them. She kept only the small brass key. And she had 1 thing more, come by honestly. The Guildhall clock's name tablet was a separate plate of brass, screwed to the movement and made to be unshipped, and the beadle, who held the keys and the lawful charge of the case, had taken it off before 2 aldermen at first light and signed it into her keeping for the day, so that no man could later cry theft. It carried Roper's name deep, and Vane's ghost beneath it. Then she went back up the hill to wait for the men with the tackle. They came at dawn on fair day, as Thorne had promised, a gang of them with block and chain and iron bars, and Silas Roper rode up behind them to see his order carried out. He found Adela sitting on the tower step with Jonah beside her, and he did not dismount. "Clear off the step," Roper said. "The tower comes down this morning. You have had your charity, Miss Ferrers. Do not make me have you removed from it." "The fair is not full yet," Adela said. "There is no crowd on the road." "What is the danger to the public, sir, when the public is not here?" Roper's face darkened. "Do not fence with me about my own order. I only ask that you keep to it," she said. "You wrote that the tower endangers the Fair Day Road. Then wait for the Fair Day Road to fill, and do your pulling down under the eyes of the very folk you claim to protect. Or is there some reason you would rather have it flat before they come?" The gang shifted. It was a fair question, and they were local men, and the market was already stirring below them. Roper could not order stone dropped on an empty road he had himself called dangerous only when full, without every man there wondering why the hurry. He was caught in the neat trap of his own excuse. "Noon," he said at last, through his teeth. "The tower comes down at noon, order or no. Sit your step till then, and welcome. It changes nothing." "No," Adela agreed. "I do not suppose it does." And so the town of Whitbourne came up for its Michaelmas fair beneath a tower marked for death, and the market filled, and the stalls went up, and by mid-morning the road below Rookhaven was thick with the whole shire, farmers and clerks and aldermen and the guild in its chains, and Osric Thorne among them. and Constance Weir on the beetle's arm with a bound ledger held to her chest, and none of them yet knowing why the farrier's woman stood so calm on a doomed step. At noon the tackle men set their bars to the tower base, and Silas Roper raised his hand to give the word, and in that exact moment, Adela reached inside the door and pulled the lever that freed the striking train. 40 feet above the crowd, the great bell that Jonah had steadied in the storm swung on its pinned frame and struck. It struck once, and the whole fair went silent as if a hand had been laid on it. It struck twice, and men took their hats off without knowing why. It struck a third time and a fourth, clean and deep and certain, a sound no living soul in that market had ever heard. The voice of a clock, the town had been told, was dead before their fathers were born. The count wheel dropped through its old true tally, and the bell told the hour it had been silent for. 12 slow strokes rolling down the hill over the heads of the whole county, and Jonah stood with both hands flat against the tower stone, and his face turned up and tears running down it, feeling every stroke come down through the wall into his palms, hearing it the only way he could ever hear anything, and this was not terror now. It was his own hand that had woken it. When the 12th stroke died, the silence after was enormous. "That clock is condemned," Silas Roper shouted into it. "It is unsafe, it is nothing, pull it down." But no man moved to the bars now, with that sound still hanging in the air, and Adela came down off the step into the front of the crowd with a plate of brass in her hand. "Before you pull it down, sir, tell the town whose clock it is," she said, and she pitched her voice to Carey, the way he had pitched his in the wool exchange. "You know. Master Thorne knows. Tell them the name on the plate. Or I will." "It carries a guild cipher," Thorne called out, stepping forward, for the crowd was his to lose now. "Founder's mark, nothing more. The woman is deranged, like the last one who made these claims." It was the wrong thing to say, and he knew it the instant it left him. "The last one who made these claims," Adela repeated, loud, into the hush. "You have said it yourselves. There was a last one. Her name was Cecily Vane." She lifted the brass plate high so the noon light caught it. "This is the plate off your Guildhall clock, the pride of Witchbourne, that you set your watches by. Read the name on it, and you read Nathaniel Roper, Warden, Founder." She turned it and held it slant to the sun, as her father had taught her, and the older cutting woke beneath the new. "And read it in a low light, the way an honest man reads a hallmark, and under his name is hers. Cecily Vane. Cut out. Cut over. The same 2 letters that strike above your heads this minute. On the one clock he never got up the tower to scrape." Constance Weir came forward then, small and straight, and put the bound ledger into the beadle's hands to open before the alderman. "I carried her coal," the old woman said, and her voice did not shake now at all. "I watched them call her mad for saying what this girl is saying. Every date is in her own hand. Alderman, the Guildhall clock is drawn in it 6 years before a Roper ever signed a peace. I have kept my mouth shut for 40 years, and I am ashamed of it. I will not keep it a day more." The eldest of the aldermen, a white-headed man who had set his own watch by the Guildhall clock for 50 years, took the ledger from the beadle with hands that were not quite steady. "I registered Nathaniel Roper's founder's mark myself, as a young clerk," he said, loud enough for the market to hear. "He told us he had drawn the Guildhall movement at 19. We wrote it in the roll. We taught it to our children." He turned a page, and another, and his face changed. "These dates run 6 years before Roper's. And here are the Guildhall wheel counts, the whole train, the measure of every arbor, and the alterations made in its very building, all in the same hand that cut the plate. No outsider could have invented these. This is the maker's own working book, kept 40 years, and the maker is named on its first leaf." "It is a forgery," Thorne said, A clever fraud got up by a debtor. Then it is a fraud that also woke the clock, the old alderman said. Forge me a bell that strikes true after 40 years, Master Thorn, and I will believe your forgery. Until then I believe the brass. And the brass says vain. The alderman bent over the ledger. They laid the dated drawings against the plate and against the tower, still ringing in their memory. And the thing was too plain and too public and too dreadful to be smoothed away. And it came apart before everyone, out loud in the open market, as it had never been allowed to come apart in a sealed room. Osric Thorn kept talking, cipher and custom and slander, and every word he said sounded worse than the last, because the crowd had heard the clock, and a man cannot argue a whole town out of a sound it felt in its chest. Silas Roper said nothing at all. He sat his horse above the fair while 3 generations of borrowed glory fell off his name in a single hour, in front of the exact people who had made the name mean something, and there was no order he could sign against it, because you cannot condemn a truth for being unsafe to the public. The tacklemen had already begun, quietly, to coil their chains. The tower was not pulled down. An unsafe structure cannot very well be the town's pride and its shame in the same breath, and by the week's end the alderman had taken Rookhaven's gate tower into the borough's keeping and set masons to make it sound. The clock stayed. It strikes yet, over the market, on the hour, and the whole shire sets its watches by it now. And every soul that hears it knows the name it keeps. They cut her name back into the brass. Cecily Vane, maker, on the Rookhaven plate and on the Guildhall plate both, deep and plain, with no other name above it, and the date the ledger gave. The guild struck Nathaniel Roper from its roll of founders, 40 years too late for the woman it was owed to, and entered Cecily Vane in his place. The first name upon that roll to belong to a woman, put there by the alderman of a town that had helped to bury her. Constance Weir lived to see it done, and said it was the only thing worth the waiting. Silas Roper left the bench before the winter. A magistrate who has sat his horse and watched his family's honor proved a theft, does not keep a town's trust, and the county quietly found another man for the work. The £81 was cleared in the end, not by his charity and not by the guild's purse, but by the borough, in payment for the recovery of its own clock, which the alderman judged a fair wage for the labor. Adela took the money as wages and not as alms, which was the whole of the difference to her, and she had earned every shilling of it in spirit and in oil. She did not leave the hill. She had come to Rookhaven with a $1 deed meant to be her grave, and she stayed as the keeper of its clock, licensed at last under the borough's own hand. The first woman in Witchbourne to hold the work in her own name since Cecily Vane was carried away. Jonah stayed with her, apprenticed to the clock he had helped to wake, and he kept the strike by feel, his palms to the frame at every hour. The boy the guild had thrown out for being deaf, grown into the one pair of hands in the shire that could tend a striking train blind. The bell that had once come down through the stone into his sleep like a terror came down into his waking now like a pulse he had set going himself. That is the name the clock tower kept, that Silas Roper never troubled to learn before he gave the ruin away for $1 to be rid of a girl. It kept the name of a woman it had outlived, waiting 40 years in the dark behind a bell for a hand patient enough to read it in a low light. Some work is buried and stays buried, and some waits, quiet and dated and true, for the one person the world discarded to climb the stair, still a bell, and set the striking free. If you have read this far up the hill with us, then you understand what Rookhaven was really worth, and it was never the stone. If you were moved by Cecily Vane's name coming home to the brass, and by the deaf boy who woke her clock, then subscribe for more stories of Lantern and Ledger, where the forgotten are read back into the record, one worn mark at a time. And tell us before you go, Would you have climbed a dark tower in a storm to still a bell you could not hear, for the sake of a frightened boy? Or would you have bolted your door and kept your bread for the morning? The tower is still there. It still keeps her name. Come up the hill again, and we will read you another.